All right. So do we want to transition into, I think one of the, as we said at the top, one of everybody's favorite things, ranking presidents.
Let's do it.
So you and I had a pretty good conversation about this a few months ago when I was in LA, when we were recording the progressive era presidents episodes. You know, we started talking about how you go about rating things. And I think that's how I want to open up this conversation is like, what are we asking when we say to rate the presidents?
Yes.
What metric are we actually judging there? And, you know, I think that, you know, when every time a new president is elected and a new one of these lists came out, as one did recently when Biden became president, it's kind of hard to parse because at a certain point you're like, it really seems to judge an intersection of who's the most famous and who seems to be the nicest.
Yeah, right. And a lot of it comes down to things that happened during their term that they were kind of just coincidentally involved with, that were made by the times.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true of the bad ones too, you know, because what we're trying to get across is how little these people actually have discretion once they reach that level of power, especially as the complexity of the machinery they rule over becomes greater and greater.
Yes, absolutely. So what do you think then when you were trying to put together your list of presidents or your rankings, what were you going for?
So I decided that I think thinking about the presidents and ranking them through a moral lens is basically beside the point, because we're trying to describe, you know, historical processes here. Trying to judge it good or bad kind of gets in the way of that, and we get colored by like these relationships to like our moral understanding of these people, when the reality is they are instruments.
Right.
So if I'm not going to think of it morally, then I have to think of it aesthetically. So I basically took the presidents, divided them into the ones that I think are interesting dudes and ones that I think are boring.
Okay.
And then taking the interesting guys and trying to, through what I know of their lives and times as president and the conditions they governed and lived during, kind of what their interior world was, their relationship to their pursuit of power.
Okay.
Both personal and like systemic. And then from that, the ones who I feel like a general sympathy towards their character, and the ones who I find intriguing through their demonic nature. So charismatic, one way or the other, like either interesting, like tragic, like tragically formed, in some few cases actually like admirable and aspirational, or just fascinatingly evil.
So you kind of have like a charisma parabola, you know, where the best and worst are going to be kind of high on, you know, their amount of actual personality, where the ones in your middle are just kind of the dullards.
Exactly, yeah. So I have 8 categories here, and they're divided broadly into not ranking, but into the ones guys who I kind of think are cool, one way or the other, and guys who I think are monstrous in a way, in like a Judge Holden type way.
Yes.
Or represent something monstrous. And then everybody else is like, who cares?
Yeah.
Like they might have interesting trivia about them, but from a real grand historical perspective, essentially nothing. Like Calvin Coolidge owned a raccoon and was going to eat it.
Yeah.
Did you know that?
Yeah, I think we talked briefly how he had like one of the weirdest selections of presidential pets.
He had an insane menagerie of pets. And he's also just this boring embodiment of 20s business liberalism.
Right.
But these guys are guys who either because they're so fascinatingly evil, or represent something so fascinatingly evil, in my understanding of like who I think of them as people, or guys who I feel like there's some glimmer of like a real human soul there, you know, some like an actual attempt to, you know, be not just an individual, you know, possessor of power, but a member of a fucking species, basically.
Sure.
So those are my groups. So amongst the guys who are like the ones who I feel like are real people that I can relate to and think broadly cool, one way or the other. Again, not really anything to do with what they did in office. And yes, all of them are monsters in the sense that they presided over a system of monstrosity because it's a fucking bourgeois capitalist dictatorship at the very moment that it was destroying like the natural biosphere, for Christ's sake. Like this is all bad stuff.
Right.
But the people who did it with different things in mind. you know?
Yeah, I think we're just trying to separate out interesting from meaning we support them and laud every action that they have ever taken.
So we got number 1 and 2 for me, because like this is the category above categories. The tribunes of humanity. These are the people who, like, because mostly of the moment that they arose onto the stage were able to embody and interact with like significant currents of human progressive development. And those are Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes, I think that in any survey, no matter how you're defining the word best, you got to put those two guys at the top.
Yeah. It's everything that like America could be, and the stuff that we live with as like the alternative was all enthroned in power to some degree or another during those presidencies. So those guys are number 1 and number 2.
But yeah, I was just like thinking about FDR and Lincoln, FDR, who you put 1, who you put 2, if you have to make an absolute ranking. And I think it's interesting because they represent different management styles and different responses to historical events. And I think that FDR maybe gets more points in terms of being a president by being kind of having a plan and ruthlessly executing it, whereas Lincoln gets more points for being perfectly reactive to situations.
Right. Because like Roosevelt had a number of moments where he really misjudged the moment. Part of it's because he had so many more moments to misjudge, like the decision to go with austerity after 1936 because of the prevailing economic orthodoxies, which had all been discredited. But, you know, again, there had to be some sort of pullback because it's still a capitalist enterprise. But whereas and Lincoln made a bunch of mistakes too, but early on, and they like things smooth out over time because of his ability to adapt. It took way longer for Roosevelt to really get the message. In fact, it was World War II that redeemed the New Deal because it had never been enough. You know, like it built our national infrastructure, but it still wasn't enough. It took the war to do that because the project was not aggressive enough. So those are like the guys who I feel like were able to actually be able to make positive effects that way, not being thwarted by, you know, overbearing reality. The material was malleable. Everybody else is more fixed in their moment, and so like the aspirational part is pretty much gone. And now we got guys who, one way or the other, are just fascinating figures, and in my mind, somewhat sympathetic, tragic heroes. And those are in order chronologically: John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. And I don't think that they're essentially there at the moment when the theoretical power of the American state and the American president is at its zenith, but is also the limits of it are being defined, right? Because the state after World War II is this supernova, an event, and that means that capital is exploding, but also the governing structures are exploding and expanding and getting more and more complicated. The president, for the first time, can press a button and kill everyone on Earth, you know? But what can they actually do? And these three presidents, back to back to back, hit the boundaries.
Or the boundaries hit them.
Well, they pushed until they got a response, basically. And that is why they're all such fascinating figures. Kennedy is the least interesting psychologically for me. You know, classic second son of a rich tyrant, just succession shit, basically. But Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon are just these titanic figures, these people who drew themselves from the mire of the struggling lower middle class of America, which is, of course, the political class of the United States, and which had been dominated by aristocratic power until finally being unleashed by, you know, the full democratization of the American electorate. The final time, like the slow push through institutions to finally have these two guys, through sheer will, bring themselves to these points, and both of them finding the limits of what they can do in the structures that they have taken control of, and they're just such richly marbled psychological figures. There's the stories of like Lyndon Johnson as a teenager being forced to do road construction work with his father, who had been a wealthy landowner and state legislator before losing all of his family's money in land speculation and being forced to essentially live on public welfare. And Nixon, his dead brothers, and going to be a carnival barker in Arizona, and his sainted Quaker mother. Oh my God. Going on, asking Pat Nixon, before she was Pat Nixon, to go on dates, having her turn him down, and then so that he could hang out with her more, agreeing to chaperone her on dates with other guys, and just sticking with it until she eventually got worn down and agreed to marry him, and then calling her buddy for the rest of their life together. Oh my God. So these guys, I can't not think about them, so I got to put them on the list.
I always think that Nixon is interesting because he, especially in the in boomer mindset, goes down as possibly the great villain of the latter half of the 20th century. And I think that status for him, I don't want to necessarily exonerate Nixon, but I think it really undersells what's going on there. It's easy to just say like, oh, he was, black and white, he was a monster, but I think it devalues the historical importance of his role in that.
He had a messianic belief in his own ability to sustain America's global power in the face of the crack up of the post-war economic order. He thought he could do that. Him and Henry Kissinger in a room could renegotiate world power to allow the U.S. to step down into a multilateral global market and avoid the accelerating contradictions of trying to maintain its paramount position as the economy globalized. That's what he tried to do. And that is an insane thing to try to do. But his life had been this incredibly uncharismatic guy had somehow pulled himself through life as a child of a struggling shop owner, and then fighting through second-rate universities because he didn't have the blood to make it at the Ivies. He didn't have the connections. And then groveling his way through the political ranks, kissing the asses of old men like Eisenhower and little Fauntleroys like Nelson Rockefeller, and then getting to that point. Why wouldn't he believe in himself?
Right.
And then, all right. So we're getting towards the middle now. So those are the two categories of guys that I have the most fond feelings for, one way or the other. And now the guys who I like in some way, and then the guys who I dislike more than I like, and then finally the bottom just turd flush. So these are the guys who I still like more than I dislike. And now we're going to flip to the ones I don't really like. But again, fascinating. You've got the men on horseback. You've got the dudes who won on the field. The guys who took all of this political bullshit and all these theoretical ideas about what the fucking country is and what we believe in and what makes Americans, and fucking showed it on the field, made it real in the land by shooting people until it was so. And these are George Washington, Ulysses Grant, and Dwight Eisenhower. And those acts, their actions in those roles are truly fascinating and show incredible abilities. But the other side of that is these guys, like a lot of very serious military men, or in the case of Grant, military savants, basically couldn't do anything else, is that they don't really have a lot of other interests, and they don't have terribly developed thoughts on things outside of that. I mean, Washington is the only founding father who did not leave a giant, a huge stack of public writings about theories of politics.
Yes. I mean, Washington is interesting to me in that way because he is like, the more you read about him, the more he seems like just a big piece of wood.
Yeah.
But he does have to, as we've talked about, take this mythological status, and he's always in most lists like top 5 presidents. And I do get high ranking of him because if it was not for him being exactly that guy, that stern piece of wood who everybody could trust exactly
without not a lot of opinions out there for people to look through.
Yeah, exactly. Who could be that boring and that taken seriously. Who knows if we could have gotten this whole project stood up, if the bicycle would have ever.
We're all very explicit on it. That creating an executive position that was effectively a secular king was way too much for most of these state ruling classes. It was too close to what they defeated. They needed someone who they could be sure was not going to seize dictatorial power, because the president was going to get to define the office, which Washington did. And the fact that there was Washington to have the job allowed them to say yes. And they figured that whatever role he created could be filled by regular mortals. And it was. So yes, incredibly important. It's like, it's the way you can't say the Beatles are overrated. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, they set the entire structure that all the stuff you like is within. You guys, what does that even mean?
So for that reason, he's also in. I do have to hand it to him. I do have to put him in my top five. But he is fascinating in his uninterestingness.
Although the fact that he was the one interesting thing about Washington is how incredibly repressed it is, and that makes him not a terribly interesting public figure by definition. But if you read about like the people who were close to him, their descriptions of him, he was furiously pissed off all the time. And there were very few moments when he would lose his stack and he would like start screaming at people. But he was mostly just this tea kettle, which is kind of interesting. And then we've got a guy who I have a deep appreciation for, Ulysses Grant, a loser, a guy who basically went to West Point because he didn't want to be a tanner, which totally understand. Tanning sounds like it would suck. Then was a mediocre student, then did wonderful work in the Mexican War, but then was asked to sit on his ass alone in a tent in California, and got bored and just drank himself shit-faced. I mean, who hasn't? Whom amongst us? And then tried to live a regular life and just couldn't hack any of it. And then went back to war and found his natural affinity. And he did, as many people point out, prove himself to be the only president who effectively prosecuted Reconstruction in terms of pursuing and neutralizing the guerrilla elements like the Ku Klux Klan. Once again, his military role, his military abilities showing themselves. It was in every other consideration of being president that he really lacked, like a lot of these generals, an actual coherent idea and a will to pursue it. And they just let the party, in this case, the robber baron Republican Party, dictate terms. And that was bad. And in a similar situation, you see Eisenhower, a character who is gray and kind of dishwater, but has a few fascinating things about him. The fact that he knew that everybody thought he was a dumb old out-of-touch man and he would play it up. There's memos when people talking about a sensitive question where he'll say, "Oh, I'll just tell them I wasn't aware of it, and they'll believe me." You know, like he knew.
I mean, that's a good gambit. Yeah. It'll get people off your back.
But his role, like defining the post-war order from a position of what he thought was the rational, reasonable center. Okay, we had the big war between capitalism and communism. Capitalism won, but we're going to knock it off a little bit. Capitalism won, but we're going to give a little bit at the center anyway. And then he tried to build on that piece, but that meant creating within it time bombs that were going to blow it up later, like the need to imperially dominate the post-colonial world.
Right.
So, and then we've got two groups who I don't really like at all. These guys leave me cold personally, but again, the talent, the historical position, undeniable. First, we've got the mascots, the guys who, whatever they were thinking, whatever they cared about, really their value was in representing a new political concept, order, set of symbols, and to embody them. And those are Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan. In all these cases, they represented emergent and powerful new forces in American politics, constructions of politics, new mass politics under Jackson, the mobilized middle class activism of the progressive state that the muscular progressive state that Roosevelt conceived of, and of course Ronald Reagan's Morning in America deregulatory consumer paradise. None of these made by them. In the case of Andrew Jackson, made by Martin Van Buren more than anybody. In the case of Teddy Roosevelt, the militancy of the working class and also the mobilization of the middle class, and with Reagan, the middle class once again revolt against liberalism that had started in the 50s. But they were all along for the ride, essentially, in one degree or another. I would argue. Teddy Roosevelt probably less than the other two, but it's hard to argue that Andrew Jackson was too committed to a program when he spent his entire first term arguing about why his cabinet members' wives were being mean to his friend.
2 points on that group. I very much get how you're categorizing them, and I appreciate that. I do have to say that out of those, Teddy is the one that I do have the most affinity for.
Also, I agree. And he's the one who is the least mascotty.
He is a very cool, like, epic guy. Yeah.
He's also the one who's least mascotty of them.
Yeah. I think that you just have to recognize, maybe even beyond or not even relevant to the presidency, just being a citizen of the world that could so fully embody the time of his lifespan, you know?
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't even think that goes that far into his actual presidency, but he is that guy.
Yep.
He is that bitch.
He is that bitch
of the turn of the 20th century. But here's a second question for you, and maybe you'll get into it after this. Would you not put Trump into that category a little bit?
I have another category for Trump.
Okay. Well, there is shades of the mascot in Trump, I feel, but
oh no, that's the thing. All of these, it's like the humors. You know, they all are. They're infused with each other. These are just like the concentrations.
Sure. Great.
You know, it's a Venn diagram overlapping.
Who has more? Who's got their stats maxed
exactly?
Who
has
out.
more of what? But no, Trump is absolutely very mascotty. And then you've got the nerds. You've got the guys who were very proud of their science fair volcanoes, and thought in some way that their nerdiness basically would redeem the project, basically would purify all of the contradictions that they knew existed within the state that they supported.
Or also that, if they had done all the homework and, if their math sheet had come back with 100%, that gave them all the skills to actually run the office.
Yes. And you got Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and of course, the nerd of nerds, Woodrow Wilson.
Sure. Yes.
Real dork-ass nerds. But guys who, in one reason or another, are fascinating characters, although they all give me the creeps.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is something, for those categories of nerds, there is something very malevolent about their cold, dispassionate approach to the job itself. Though I do think, it's hard to say who achieved more, Jefferson and just his massive expansion of the state, or Wilson for solidifying really what would be modernity.
Yeah.
Into the 21st century of America,
Yeah, no, they both are there to create a model for populist politics, basically, within a ideological structure that could then actually exert power through the political system. So now we're getting into the lower realms. These are the guys, I don't like them too much. First, you've got the cosmic chumps.
See, this is a category that I feel like I have listed out in my own separate list of guys that I have sympathy for.
See, I understand why, but in my mind, I just can't not blame their personal failings as human beings for their decisions. Like, they were brought down by their own faults, And those are Andrew Johnson, Harry Truman, and Jimmy Carter.
In one of my little lists, I have Carter, Truman, Johnson as one chunk.
No, those are some chump-ass chumps.
See, I thought that you might be referring to a different category, which includes like Ford, but that's maybe another list that I want to talk about. Yes, I see what your definition of cosmic chump is.
I mean, they're all, in two cases, guys who rose up into political power with barely any effort on their own, like pulled up through the ranks by other forces just to basically fill a quota. And then when in power, operated off of their own smugly self-confident belief in their abilities and just fucked the dog on everything. And in all their cases helped contribute to the deep deforming of American political institutions. Now, of course, I'd say Carter is the least personally responsible for that. But with Truman and especially Johnson, you've got a guy who literally stuck his dick in the spinning fan on purpose and then just got dick chunks everywhere and broke the fan.
Well, that's a very colorful
Yeah.
way of putting it. However, Carter's sense of sanctimoniousness leaves me with the a bad taste as well, even if he isn't as outwardly as much of a fuck up as the other two.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, Carter is also a very recognizable modern type. You know, like
Yes.
the well-intentioned but sort of unself-consciously narcissistic liberal who believes in virtue and their own virtue and have and have confused that virtue with God.
Yes.
So now we got the last category here. These are the guys who fascinating figures, but I mostly have negative feelings towards viscerally.
Okay.
And these are the demiurgical archons. These are,
All right.
and they're all modern presidents. These are the presidents who recognized the essential powerlessness of the office as time moved on, and dealt with that not by raging against it or ignoring it, but by willing themselves into being a instrument, a conscious instrument of the system, like merge with the machine of their own volition. And these are Martin Van Buren, the little magician, old Kinderhook himself, but at a low level because we're dealing with much more degree of freedom there to do political activity. So therefore, a machine that can do much less evil than the ones we have now. What we have are George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barfsack O'Crumbo himself, Barack Obama. And these are people who said, I have looked into the eye of Sauron, and it sounds great. Let's do it.
And I think what's notable about that list is that those are the three manifestations of what I guess we would call old school liberalism into the 21st century. Obviously HW was a Republican, but he was the last vestige of the mid-century liberalist Republican way as it was being subsumed into modern, just glass chewing conservatism.
Right. And he was willing to go along for the ride on everything. At every level, in order to preserve his position, which is that's the only way that you can consciously seek power now. So what we have had since the 70s has been an alteration between these figures of like self-willed evil and these collection of hollowed out dummies who really only differ in their degree of personal narcissism, like Reagan was a mascot in a way Trump isn't, because he really was happy to find the mark, step on it, and read the lines and convince himself that was good. Donald Trump had an independent agenda as president, but it was just his own personal brand. And that is different than a mascot. You don't want your mascot doing that. That's a bad mascot. But he is achieving power the only other way you can in this context, if you're not willfully an instrument of capital in some way, is to be some kind of damaged narcissist who has been hollowed out of anything else by one process or another, like Joe Biden and like George W. Bush, where they can tell themselves they're doing good, but it's because their brains in many fundamental ways are not really picking up all the frequencies. And in Donald's cases, any frequency that might be picked up is just drowned out by his own voice.
But the internal scream of Donald Trump.
They're just out there. Like Joe Biden is the Democratic Party, petrified into a skeleton, but just as an instrument of ambition, the personal ambition of Joe Biden, which has always been since he was a child, what he saw the Democratic Party as a way for Joe Biden to be president. He was actually always very forward about that, really, with the people around him, that he saw politics as a way to get paid and get renowned and get power and get social advancement with the abilities he had, which were basically a really good set of teeth.
All right. I think that is about as good of a ranking system as one could come up with for at least a categorizing system. I do want to shout out one genre that I alluded to earlier that I had a kind of fondness to that I thought you were going to say in your Cosmic Chumps. But this is your Gerald Fords, your Garfields, your Hoovers, and your Quincy Adamses.
Let's call these the Schlemiels.
Yes, they are the Schlemiels.
Because like there's not as much cosmicness around this chumpery.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like, just a personalized thing of like, oh boy, look at him. Oh man.
Yeah. Especially like Ford and Garfield, I ended up having a lot of sympathy for. You know, Ford just being consummately president football all the way down and getting in there under a bizarre set of circumstances and having like basically not knowing what other levers to pull other than just calling a nationwide huddle and saying it's the top of the fourth quarter and we're down, but we can't give up. I need everybody to put their hands in, give it 110%. We'll get through this together,
We're going to whip inflation now.
Yeah, exactly. So I have sympathy for Ford. Garfield, of course, just getting picked off the convention floor for being a pretty good guy.
Speech.
Yeah, gave a speech so good that he got made president and then immediately killed by a crazy
just
person.
Automatically owned. And then the way he died.
Yeah. Oh, God,
getting killed by his own doctor who was his old army buddy because they stopped feeding him from his mouth and started pumping bouillabaisse and whiskey up his ass.
Yeah. Very, very sorry to Garfield. And then Hoover, I mean, I kind of put in there more because he's a really interesting guy. And of course he is, one of these business Republicans of the 20s. But I think that there's a little more Frisian to him. And, at certain times, dictating the food supplies during the war and insisting on, bailing out the Bolsheviks as they were starving during the Russian Civil War. He's got something to him. He's got that sense of genius of management and then just gets owned by circumstances.
Yep.
And
unable himself to imagine his way out of the cul-de-sac.
Yeah,
because he is one of our longest lived presidents. He lived into his 90s.
Yeah, into the 60s. Yeah,
yeah, and he spent his whole life writing pissed off letters to the editor about how everybody was doing too much socialism.
Yeah,
because he believed in charity, and why wouldn't he? He'd been a very effective coordinator of it his whole career. No, Hoover's also very interesting, and the other Quaker president, I believe, him and Nixon.
I also want to shout out somebody who I don't think often gets on the bottom 5 list that I think should, or towards the bottom. Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, just for being the guy to first call in the army against the labor movement, and really like. Not that it would have gone any other way, but being the guy to sign the order to put, the weapon of the state, in the hands of capital,
Literally taking troops away from protecting black freedmen in the South and their political rights and sending them to cities to shoot workers.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Underrated scumbag.
All right. Let's move on to a quick lightning round about who are your guys. And then we're going to move on to final thoughts and wrap up this show once and for all.